Good afternoon. It's my genuine pleasure and privilege to be addressing you today. This is a terrific event focused on an immensely important set of issues. I've had a deep interest in cross-sector social interaction for nearly 30 years, I guess. My academic career began focused on cross-sector interorganizational collaboration, and so I think of this very much as home turf for me. Before I begin, I'd like to very sincerely thank the symposium organizers, the Chemie Business School, and especially Anne-Marie Ryan and Juana Bronzai for the lovely invitation. I also want to say how nice it is to see so many friends here today, or at least imagine you there today. I didn't realize it was going to be such a reunion. So my talk today is on place and partnerships, echoing the theme of the conference. And for me, interorganizational partnerships are a really profound mechanism for achieving progress in addressing significant global challenges like climate change, inequality, systemic racism, and right now pandemic diseases. My own interest in partnerships began nearly 30 years ago when Nelson Phillips, Cynthia Hardy, and I began doing research on collaboration in a variety of domains, including refugee settlement, ecotourism, HIV/AIDS treatment. At the time, we were working from a core intuition that there was something about the relationship between partnerships, institutions, and important problems in the world that we wanted to explore. Of course, we were following the work of many others, and especially the path-breaking work of Professor Barbara Gray. Our early work emphasized the role of discourse in mediating the relationships between participants, partnerships, institutions, and social problems. In our study of HIV/AIDS treatment, for example, we explored the discursive strategies used by community groups to influence the behavior of pharmaceutical groups and the policy of the federal government in Canada. More recently, I've been studying urban poverty on the west coast of Canada, where I was living for many years. My focus there was primarily on responses to drug addiction and homelessness, and in both cases, partnerships were central to the innovations I was observing. In doing these studies, though, I found that I had to expand the scope of what I was looking at. I kept studying discourse in institutions. Those were really my tools that were most at hand, most comfortable. But in both cases, these concepts were really insufficient to understand the partnership dynamics that shape the responses to those serious social problems. And so we started to develop alternative, more integrative framework. And the limitations of discourse in institutions as lenses, that was one of the central motivations that led Nelson Phillips and I to start to develop what we refer to as a social symbolic work perspective. So the core idea behind this perspective is that there are a wide range of forms of work examined in organization studies: identity work, institutional work, emotion work, boundary work. But the study of these different forms of work has remained largely disconnected. There have been, and especially recently, attempts to connect across individual pairings, mostly of these kinds of work, identity work and institutional work, for instance, or emotion work and institutional work. But the study of these different forms has not been integrated in any really significant way. And so that was the aim, that was our aim in developing the social symbolic work perspective. So that's the perspective I wanted to take today to apply to places and partnerships. So first I want to talk to you a little bit just about the perspective itself, and then I'll talk about a study that I did, kind of reinterpreting it both through a lens of place and partnership and through a lens that focuses on social symbolic work. So to start with, we define social symbolic work as purposeful, reflexive efforts of individuals, collective actors, and network of actors to shape what we call social symbolic objects. The book is largely focused on this idea of work. It kind of comes in many ways from previous work I've done with other colleagues on institutional work. And so it started embedded in and kind of motivated, rooted in the idea of work, and the focus of the book really remains on that. But one thing we found interesting, and it's especially interesting in relationship to the focus of this conference, is the significance of what we refer to as social symbolic objects. So when we began working on the book, we had this relatively simple aim of cataloging, organizing different kinds of work in organizations. But we realized that if we were going to suggest that these forms of work constituted some kind of conceptual family, that there had to be some core to that conceptual resemblance, so we had to start to develop some more elaborated understanding of social symbolic work as a concept itself. Now, there are a number of pieces to it, but the important piece for today is that all forms of social symbolic work are organized in relationship to particular kinds of what we call social symbolic objects. So these are a wide range of objects in organizational life. They can be strategies, boundaries, technologies, emotions, etc. More formally, we define social symbolic objects as combinations of discursive, relational, and material elements that constitute meaningful patterns in social systems. Now, this is obviously quite a mouthful, so let me unpack it a little bit. So first, we'll start with the idea of a pattern. Now, this is simultaneously a simple and a complex idea. What we mean by a pattern is a socially constructed, interpretable entity that describes some perceived consistency across space and time. In some ways, I suppose that's the more complicated version of a complex definition. But if you think about examples, it becomes maybe a little bit easier. And so if we go back to Mintzberg, for instance, and his conception of strategy, he defines strategy as a pattern in a stream of decisions. And the point about patterns is that they're not independent of the social system in which they exist. They're dependent on the actors involved to construct, create, maintain, and hold those things as patterns. Lots of social symbolic objects, and in fact, we'll argue all of them have important material dimensions. So these could include everyday physical objects, furniture and tools, natural objects like flowers and food, but they can also involve concepts that we think of as institutional. So endangered species, refugees, conferences. The idea of a conference could be a social symbolic object. Now, if we look across the research on different kinds of social symbolic work, what we see is there's a lot of writing, a lot of research that has explored the construction and identification of different objects. But what's much less developed is an understanding of the relationships that exist among objects, how they're connected to each other, how they shape each other, and so on. And for us, these relationships between social symbolic objects are especially interesting as a potential future area of research. And the way we think about it is that the relationship between objects is not inherent in the objects itself. It's a matter of social symbolic work that connects different kinds of objects. So different kinds of work translate objects across time and space, as we see in the translation literature. We can think of work enacting objects as instances of broader categories or concepts. We could think of categories or concepts themselves being based on or kind of theorized out of existing sets of objects. And then there's also even work that inverts the meaning of objects to create new, related, but different objects. So we think of these kinds of moves, these moves connecting different objects, as representing a significant opportunity, both in terms of interesting theoretical ideas, but especially in terms of addressing significant social problems. And it's these relationships between social symbolic objects that I want to explore today in terms of the relationship between places and partnerships. And so what I'm going to talk about now is a study that makes this much more concrete and that allows us to conceptualize places and partnerships as kinds of social symbolic objects. Oops. So the work I was doing in Vancouver for many years was on urban poverty, in particular looking at drug addiction. And an important focus of this research was on the places that drug users consume drugs. So this included what were referred to as safe sites, which was in many ways the focus of what I was doing. And I'll get into what those look like. But to understand safe sites, I think it's important to understand what might be described as less safe sites. So I'll keep jumping ahead, sorry. A not uncommon place at the time and even now for drug users to inject drugs was in alleys. And so you see the picture on the right, typical downtown Vancouver alley. And these are places in which heroin and cocaine intravenous drug users would go. Typically together in 2 or 3 people was easier to do it with, often using puddle water to mix drugs with, often shaking the drugs in solution rather than boiling them in order to make them injectable. And in order to understand why places are so important in this story, you need to understand a little bit about drug use and overdose. And the key here is that most heroin overdoses are not necessarily fatal. If an overdose is responded to rapidly, it can usually and easily be treated with a simple injection of a stimulant. So it's when people who overdose are left too long that they tend to die. And so this makes the kind of geography of drug injection a really important part of it. Now, one of the problems for people injecting in an alley is that if they overdosed, they were dependent on whoever they were with to call for help. But those people typically also had simply just injected drugs, and they didn't have cell phones, which meant they had to go to a local store or a business and ask to use the phone or ask employees to call an ambulance. It also meant they potentially had to wait around for an ambulance or police to direct them to the person in trouble. So as you can imagine, this left a lot of people simply dying alone in alleys. I won't go into the statistics, but the statistics were horrendous. So my study focused initially on Insight, which was North America's, or at least described as North America's first supervised injection site. Opened in September 2003, it's still open. And there's a whole kind of history since that time that I could talk about at some other point. Now, the interesting thing about Insight in terms of places is that even though it was described as the first injection site, supervised injection site in North America, it really wasn't. There were at least 6 or 7 that opened before then. I'll just show you a picture of the inside of Insight before we look at the previous ones, so you have an idea what we're talking about, given this is a discussion of place. Here's the inside of the place. This is what an injection room looks like. And it looks very, in many ways, unextraordinary. Those cubicles are for people to inject. The mirrors are so that the nurse who is sitting behind them can keep an eye on them to make sure that they don't get into trouble, but also gives them a modicum of privacy so they can be facing away from the nurse rather than toward, as the partitions are also meant for privacy. Now, what I want to do is talk through very quickly the evolution of the places that preceded this injection room. And so before Insight opened in 2003, the history goes back about 8 years. And so the first site that opened, Vancouver's first site, was known as the Back Alley. It was opened by Livingston, who was a single mother in the area, Bud Osborne, who was a drug user, poet, activist. And it was really just a couple of storefront rooms they rented. It was completely illegal, but was known to the police, and it was used by between 80 and 200 drug users each night. That closed a few months later, and there wasn't another really organized injection site for a number of years. But during that period, drug users started to open up their rooms as individuals to each other to use as safe injection sites, or these supervised injection sites. And so as a drug user said at the time, I open my room for anyone to come in and get high, but the thing is after 8 o'clock, there's no visitors allowed in my hotel. So from 8 till 8, there's no place for people to go except for the alley. So we move forward a few years and we get to a second kind of wave of sites. And the first one was another illegal site. It was opened on Dunleavy Street in the summer of 2000. And it was opened by HRAS, H-R-A-S, which was the Harm Reduction Action Society. It was a kind of diverse set of individuals, health workers, patients, drug users, researchers. And again, it was opened in part spurred on by Livingston again, who stood up in a meeting and just challenged people to do something. There were two more sites opened in this period, and these were interesting ones because these were not illegal sites, but they were specific kinds of sites, both opened by First United Church. And First United was a kind of classic urban church, long tradition of reaching out to disadvantaged residents, a soup line, clothing exchange, a welfare advice service, and so on. And so then in December 2001 and April 2002, it opened two demonstration sites. The first one was only open for a day, and it was intended to let the public see what a site would look like. They invited the media, they invited school groups, got quite a lot of press. And even though it was very short-lived, it was very intendedly realistic. They spent quite a lot of time building it to look a lot like the models they had seen of injection sites already established in Frankfurt. And then the church opened a second site in April the following year, and this was aimed more at drug users, primarily as an educational facility, teaching them strategies on how to take care of their veins, how to do a proper tourniquet, how to ensure equipment would be sterile, and so on. So you have this middle wave of slightly more kind of elaborated, if you like, sites. And then the final wave of sites began a couple of years later. And this is a kind of interesting story because Insight is the name of the government's official supervised injection site, but there was a previous Insight that was unveiled, but it was never opened. So in February 2003, the Portland Hotel Society, which was a downtown housing NGO, opened also with the Vancouver area network of drug users and another NGO called Life Is Not Enough. They built and opened a facility that was intended to become the official Insight. The media were invited. There were 2,000 tulips to echo the 2,000 deaths that occurred in the overdose deaths in the area. And the media described it as 6 stalls where people could inject drugs, sinks and mirrors at each one, an observation platform at the back of the room, a spacious waiting room, and what they described as the feel of a low-budget art gallery. This was a kind of transition. It never quite opened. And there was a period, it was a kind of a pause because of political reasons that kind of led to the final illegal site opening on Carroll Street in April 2003, really just a few months before the government opened theirs. And for the purposes of this talk, what was interesting about it was organized by a coalition of individuals and groups. It had Anne Livingston again, Van Du, the drug users, an anti-poverty coalition, the Housing Action Committee, a downtown legal society. It was rented by a religious studies instructor at UBC. It was partly funded by the previous mayor's son. And it also had the systematic involvement of academic researchers who were gathering data on injection sites. And so it was a much more complex, both social and material kind of operation. And finally, all of these sites culminated in the opening of Insight, the slide that you saw previously. This was a new supervised injection site, 12 seats, purpose-built at the cost of over $1 million Canadian. It opened in September 2003, and it was operated by a partnership, including Vancouver Health, Portland Health Society. It had the support of the city, endorsement by politicians, the cooperation of the police, and again, ongoing research by UBC academics. And so that's a very, very quick run through the kind of history of precursor places and partnerships in the development of Insight. Now, what I want to do is step back a little bit from the details of the places and partnerships to kind of conceptualize them as social symbolic objects and look at what this relationship might look like. And what I want to argue is that when you step back, you start to see a recursive relationship. Oh, I just messed something up. There we go. Just like a live presentation. So I want to step back and say that when we look across these sites, these safe sites, what we see is a recursive relationship linking the partnerships associated with them and the places that were formed. And the relationship becomes one that evolves over time, and I think becomes a bit more clear when we can understand these places as social symbolic objects and as the product of social symbolic work. And I mentioned in the definition of social symbolic objects that we think of these objects and work as having three key dimensions: discursive, material, and relational. And if we look at the evolution of those dimensions across the story, we can start to see, I think, some interesting kinds of connections. So if we look at the early sites, we see experimental places, we describe them as tied to interpersonal relationships. So in terms of materiality, the early places, the back alley, the drug users' rooms, they were really simple transformations of existing spaces. The discursive and relational dimensions of these places and partnerships were also relatively simple. The message, if you think about it in terms of meaning, associated with the places was simply, come be with us and we'll look after you. The transformations were tied to relatively simple, direct interpersonal partnerships, and Livingston and Bud Osborne, who became friends, and among individual drug users. If we move further through the story, we see an increasing complexity associated with the places and partnerships. The next three sites, the Dunleavy site, the two First United Church sites, they were more elaborate transformations, greater injections of material resources, more elaborate sets of meanings. So the meanings, for instance, of the places were not only in terms of care, but also in terms of justice and public health. The last three places, the First Inn site that never opened, the Carroll Street illegal site, and the Official Inn site, were what I describe as embedded places. The meanings of each of these sites included layers of science, government, progressive politics, as well as the ideas of care, harm reduction, and public health that were associated with the earlier safe sites. And not only were their meanings and materiality developed in more complex ways, but they were also significantly more connected to routines and relationships across organizations and systems. The interorganizational networks that formed them were publicly and explicitly debated in terms of the meaning of the relationships of the organizations and individuals involved. So my argument is that these relationships aren't coincidental. They're important links between the kinds of places around which action occurs and the partnerships to which those places are tied. Relatively simple interpersonal partnerships are supported and support experimental places. More complex, elaborated places are supported by and also support the interest groups that form them. And then interorganizational networks support and are supported by what I describe here as embedded places. So just to conclude a few thoughts, I want to make three quick points about an understanding of places and partnerships as recursively constructed social symbolic objects. And the first is a very simple point and familiar to a lot of people here, that when you're exploring places, it's really important to conceptualize them as more than locations or material structures. A key part of this is the meaning that's associated with places and consequently their situatedness in social systems and their connections to actors in action. The second and third points I think are maybe a bit more coming directly from the idea of social symbolic work, and that's that when we conceptualize places and partnerships as social symbolic objects, it allows us to explore them in terms of this set of dimensions, discursive, material, relational, that underpin them both. And rather than, as we often do, conceptualize each object in our study in kind of idiosyncratic ways, really separating identities from institutions or boundaries or technologies, focusing on underlying common dimensions, I think allows us to see the connections more clearly. And I think that really flows into the last point, that these dimensions also allow us to more clearly see and kind of pull out the forms of work, both that are associated with the movement of objects and the connection of objects, but also the ways in which those objects act as resources for different forms of work. So let me just close with a word of thanks to the conference organizers. It looks like it's going to be a fantastic conference full of really interesting work on place and partnerships. For me, this invitation allowed me to revisit a study with a different focus that was genuinely kind of fascinating for me and kind of revelatory for my own understanding of the work I'd already done. I hope you've enjoyed my talk. I look forward to your questions and our conversation.